The Nike Vaporfly NEXT 2 is so tech heavy and yet so simple and efficiently designed. The only way I figured I could do the shoe justice was to show you how this shoe interacts with your foot in the ground through every phase of a runner's gait cycle. From the point that the foot contacts the ground all the way through to the next strike, the NEXT 2 does something unique and interesting at every point along the way. So let's get into them. And at the contact point of your gait cycle, or when your foot actually strikes down, during that part of gait, you're either going to be hitting the ground with your heel, midfoot, or forefoot, or some gray area in between there. Now on the Vapors, when you come down on them, you're bringing 2 to 3 times your body weight on that one foot that's in contact with the ground. So the ZoomX foam, because it's actually PebX foam, is actually able to absorb so much energy, being that it's got the best properties of TPU foams with that extra elasticity and memory of PebX, allowing it not only to neutralize shock, but more importantly, exchange that energy, which we'll talk about in a second. And speaking of the contact phase and striking, to see which type of strikers that the Vaporflies fit best, you kind of first have to talk about their fit, which I find to be the most kind of interesting part of these, because the footbed on them does seem so streamlined and kind of narrow, but somehow they still accommodate narrow, medium, and even a wide foot because of how they flare at the big toe joint and fifth metatarsal head before flaring back into the toes. The problem with the fit of the NEXT 2s is how minimal the heel counter is. Even with this bunting in here, you really want to try to go true to size on these to get a good lockdown. Now Orthotics will also prop up the heel a bit too much, so if you're going to use them, just make sure they are very low profile. But I gotta say, I do like the protection in these shoes, especially in the mid and forefoot, as well as the stack and the heel, which we'll see later in the teardown. But they do protect against a wide range of foot ailments just on their own, even without any augmentation. But in terms of specifically what strikers are good for these shoes, if you're a chronic ankle sprainer and heel strike at all, just look somewhere else. The taper is just too much in these. Otherwise, I don't see an issue with them if you are a heel striker, unless you're somebody also with Achilles tendonitis, just because that taper, once again, just can introduce a little bit of instability in the heel, and that can add a little bit of toggling, which does then increase inflammation in the Achilles tendon, and you know where that's going from there. But moving from heel to midfoot, I think midfoot strikers are where these fit best, just being able to use the most of the midsole's benefits, as well as just the overall shape of the mid and forefoot of these shoes. It just seems to match a midfoot strike best. And because these have a surprisingly anatomic ball of foot shape, a forefoot striker can use these. You just may wear rubber down a little bit quicker, and the reason for that increased wear can be explained looking at the NEXT 2 during the next phase of the gait cycle, which is mid stance. So during your mid stance, your foot is now going through its most vulnerable period when the joints are having to go from really rigid and stable to flexible and unstable to prep for another propulsion. And it's here along the way where the Vapor can really aid you in making this portion of the gait cycle as smooth and as efficient as possible, and thus saving you from those chronic repetitive injuries. And that starts in the outsole, where you have this block design with rolled edges to each block, allowing easier rolling through the mid stance, no pun intended. The rubber also mimics the shape of the mid and forefoot, allowing your foot to kind of grab the ground a little easier, feel the ground easier, and thus be more efficient and confident with each strike and mid stance. But the downside to that is if you look at the outsole durability test, the Dremel 10 seconds highest grit sandpaper, about 1.5 millimeters of damage on a just slightly more than 2 millimeter tread depth, and the durometer, or the measure of the rubber's hardness, only comes in at a 7, which is great for traction and feel, but when striking a smaller surface area like in a forefoot striker over miles and miles, it's just not going to hold up versus the rest of the shoe, which is why I said earlier, forefoot strikers just need to watch out for quicker wear in these. And looking at the midsole teardown, these took me absolutely forever to cut through because it is almost all carbon fiber. And this is kind of where all the hype of these come from. The enormous stack of dual density ZoomX foam with that near full length carbon fiber plate just loads potential energy so ridiculously well because the carbon fiber is encased in foam on its top and underside, which means it can load energy from both sides and release energy on both sides, which gives the Vaporflies a literal kick during mid-stance. Because as your foot is pronating through this part of the gait cycle, the overall shape of the Vaporflies, as well as the foam and carbon fiber, is taking the energy you're putting into the mid and forefoot of the shoe and pushing it through the midsole in an equal and opposite direction, making the shoe literally feel like it's bucking against you or pushing you forward. And that reverse buckling action or kick also helps these to resist too much pronation, making these a surprisingly decent option for overpronators. And so from that contact period to the transition of mid-stance, that brings you into propulsion. And with that midsole uncoiling and the streamlined shape along the inside of these shoes, the push-off power of these is just nearly unmatched. Because if you look at the jump height test, 41 centimeters, which matches my best heights even in the most springy and jump-focused basketball shoes I played in this year. And typically with running shoes, because they can taper so much in the forefoot, it's hard to get a decent spring off of your forefoot when you're doing the jump height test. However, in these, because of that reverse buckling effect, that carbon fiber and foam is loading my forefoot and rear foot, giving me almost the entire shoe to use, even though I'm only contacting the ground with my forefoot. It's just such efficient and just amazing engineering. And so as you now move from propulsion into swing, this is where the most fun part of the shoe comes into play. When you look at the back of these and see how it tapers in here into this tail fin, it may look like just a decoration, but it's really meant to decrease wind resistance, because when your foot is accelerating backwards through the first part of swing, the back of your shoe is now having to cut a hole through the air versus when you're coming down and your forefoot is having to. And as the foot starts to come through swing and prepare for another contact, this is where the uppers of the Vaporflies really start to kick into gear. Because what happens now is the foot has to decelerate, get stable, and prepare for another contact. And as you can see in the upper design, the laces diverge laterally. And this design is not by accident, because what's happening now is the foot has to decelerate and just swing in a tad. And what's doing that is a giant muscle in your leg called the tibialis anterior. And that muscle contacts right here on the top and inside of your foot. And so now that you have contact with the shoe and your foot, and it's completely seamless where there's no points of failure there, that muscle has such an easier time controlling your foot and the shoe, and therefore makes that swing phase that much faster and more efficient. Plus you're getting all of that flyweave contacting the majority of your foot, which is just surprisingly strong and durable for such a light shoe. I mean, just look at the upper durability test, the Dremel 10 seconds highest grit sandpaper. The Dremel doesn't even come close to coming through that upper woven layer. And even though that is a test of abrasion resistance, it just goes to show you how strong those individual fibers can be and how together it brings this shoe in such close contact with your foot and almost makes it just an extension of your leg. And now that the Next Percent 2 has gone through an entire gait cycle, you can see at every point along the way, this shoe just increases the efficiency a little bit versus other shoes, gives you a little more power than other shoes, just a little bit less work on your body than other shoes, and over miles and miles, that's what leads to these shoes being so elite. Now the Vaporfly Next Percent 2 is certainly not for everybody. They don't handle wet conditions all that well, they don't turn especially well. Softer surfaces like mulch, gravel, or even a track really kind of decrease their effectiveness. And if you are a larger runner, chronic ankle sprainer, or just have an excessively outflared foot, you may have a little trouble with containment. But for a road running shoe or even just a walking shoe, the easy speed and efficiency of these is just really hard to ignore. And until you try them on, it's easy to call these all gimmicks, but at least from where I'm standing, it's pretty easy to see where Nike is putting most of their R&D, because everything down to the most granular pieces of this shoe have a clear purpose. And that's usually what makes a product elite versus just eh. But let me know what you think. Are you a fan or still a holdout? Let me know down below. And if you want to see another over-engineered monster of a shoe, make sure you check out my review and teardown of the On Cloud monster above and subscribe down below. Respect your rubber and foam. I'll see you in the next video.